I'm endlessly fascinated and curious about the world around us, about business, about politics, about the arts, about culture, developments, social issues, and the people. Most importantly, about the people that are shaping our future. Every night, I get the opportunity to have conversations, to dive into conversations with thought leaders, with change makers, entrepreneurs, politicians, and everyday heroes who unpack the ideas and stories that I think matter to all of us. What's the future of our economy? What's the future of our country? How do we build stronger communities? What can we learn from music, theater, sports, politics, the arts? How does policy shape our real lives? What does leadership look like, real leadership in today's environment? If it's interesting and relevant and topical and we're talking about it, you'll hear about it here at 6 o'clock on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I want to have real conversations, in-depth conversations. These are ideas we're sharing. This is the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Thanks for joining me. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. So the Ontario Liberal Party is coming up to a big convention, and there's one issue that I don't want to talk about today, which is the leadership review, because for potentially obvious reasons that some of you may know, I'm not wanting to comment on that process. But I think there's some other big issues that are going to come up with the Ontario Liberal Party. And so I wanted to focus on some of them if I could. And I've got a guest today. Roberta Tevlin is her name. She is the sister of someone who I think of extremely highly, who has been involved in politics for a long period of time. And I think the daughter of someone who has been involved in politics for a long period of time. And so I think that we'll end up having an interesting family discussion with Roberta. But she has not been involved in politics until very recently, where she's become very passionate about electoral reform and the challenge with our first past the post system, and the need for some reform in that regard. And so I thought it'd be interesting to have her on and to talk about that. Roberta, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Brian. Yeah, I'm kind of a weird political outsider. I had politics all around me from a very early age. When I was about 5, I went on the stage at Massey Hall in my pretty dress to give flowers to Mrs. Pearson, the Prime Minister's wife at the time. But I think I kind of got scared off direct political involvement and instead put my time into other volunteer activities. But these last 2 elections made me realize how important it is to be involved with political parties if you actually expect to get anything done.
Okay, so let's hold off on that for 30 seconds. Just tell everyone a little bit about who your father is, who your brother is, who your niece is.
Sure. My father was Joseph Potts. He was involved in the Liberal Party forever and ever. He was campaign manager for a number of people, and he himself ran twice provincially, and I believe he still holds the record for the 2 closest calls. He lost by 250 votes one time and 150 votes the next time. So that was my father. And
what riding?
It was Rosedale St. David's at the time. It was very, very conservative. So to almost win was, in fact, a huge thing. And then my brother Arthur, he's been politically involved with the Liberals for a long time. And when he ran as MPP in my riding of Beaches East York, well, okay, at that point I got involved. You support family. And so I was, dropping off pamphlets and putting up signs and all that stuff. And then when his daughter, Robin Buxton Potts, ran in the last municipal election, I helped her with her campaign, and I even knocked on doors and talked to people. And it actually wasn't that bad. So so when these last 2 elections came along, I dove in. I worked with both the Liberal MPP for this riding and the Liberal MP for this riding. And they both got in.
They both got in. So there were victories.
Yes, yeah.
But yet at the same time,
completely due to my efforts, of course.
Of course. But your experience is such that you're convinced that our first past the post system doesn't work. Why?
Yeah, because the Conservatives once again have a majority. And with that majority, they don't have to pay attention really to anybody. They don't have to pay attention to the other MPPs. They don't have to pay attention to lobby groups. They don't have to pay attention to protesters. These are all things I've been involved in, except for the MPP part. All these advocacy activities, I don't think have any effect because the Conservatives, with their majority, can just ignore every other group. And so they got a majority with only 43% of the vote. And with the time before it was 42%, the time before was 41%. They have total power, and they don't actually have a real majority of the votes.
And I think one of the other things is that the NDP got far fewer votes than the Liberal Party, and yet gets more seats. And so, you've got this situation because the Liberal vote is concentrated, and the NDP vote is actually the Liberal vote is not concentrated. I apologize.
That's right. Yes.
And the NDP vote is concentrated. The NDP vote is more effective than the Liberal vote, and so, I think the analysis was that an NDP vote was worth several times what a Liberal vote was worth, and a Conservative vote similarly was worth several times what a Liberal vote was worth. And so, with something like 40% of the vote for the Conservatives, they got over 70% of the seats. With something around 20% of the votes, the NDP got something like 30% of the seats. With something like 30% of the votes, the Liberals got less than 10% of the seats. And so, you've got this strange situation where a Liberal vote in very rural Ontario is probably a lost vote. A Conservative vote, frankly, in some really great downtown urban ridings in Toronto is probably a lost vote. And that doesn't make sense. And I think it really harms people's desire to go out and vote. So what do you want to do about it? What are you doing about it?
Well, given that the Green Party is already strongly in favor of electoral reform, and the NDPs are in favor of a particular version, the mixed member proportional, I believe it is, it's kind of like the Liberals are the holdout. They did not include electoral reform in their election platform. And if we could get the Liberals to come out strongly in favor of electoral reform, then those three parties could form an alliance. They could collaborate. They could work together in the next election to take away that majority from the Conservatives. And then the three of them working together could bring in electoral reform. And it appears that around the world, countries that have brought in electoral reform, it's very rarely been a single party that does it. It's a coalition of parties that bring it through. And so I think there's a real possibility that if the Liberals come out strongly in favor of electoral reform, join with the NDP and the Green, we could get that change.
So in, I think it was 2015, Justin Trudeau ran on a campaign that this would be the last election under the first past the post system. I think the quote was he said it 1,500 times or something like that during that election campaign. And, they studied it after the fact. And because they couldn't come to a conclusion of what was a better system, particularly what was a better system that the Liberals could do well under, they decided not to go forward with it. Dalton McGuinty also similarly promised a referendum on it, but ended up campaigning against it, and argued that one of the big negatives is this mixed member proportional would end up doubling the size of all the politicians, and people don't like politicians, and so therefore the idea of doubling the number of MPPs was deemed the most worst thing that could ever happen. BC is similarly also taken a look at it, and had senior government people supporting it, but then voted against it in the end. And then people will tell me as I talk to them, look at Israel, look at Italy. Examples of proportional representation are some governments that sort of never get their act together. And a lot of people are criticizing, Israel right now, that, one of the reasons why the current Prime Minister Netanyahu is doing what he's doing is because he's controlled by, the voting blocs on the extreme right, the extreme religious right. And without their support, he won't have power. And so, the the proportional representation is actually the problem, not the solution. How do you respond to all that?
Well, I've also heard both we tried it before and it didn't work, or the political parties, they say they're going to do it and then they don't. So there's that argument, which I would counter with, how about we make it work this time? And it's involved with the other part where, yes, there are countries, no surprise, that have a different system that it does not look like the country we'd like to have. I think it's really, really important for this to work. We got to get the right system for Ontario. And it's complicated. There's so many different systems. They have their pros and their cons. This is why we, in our resolution, we are calling for a nonpartisan, that part's critical, nonpartisan citizens assembly. You need to have a group of people without a particular party agenda to make this decision. So as you yourself mentioned, we could have had a change in our system federally, but they didn't like the answer they got from the nonpartisan group. And it was not the one that favored the Liberals. So they didn't follow through. We're not going to get a change unless the coalition, some kind of cooperative group with the NDPs, Liberals, and Greens, unless those three parties work together and come up with a solution that appears to be fair, not favoring one party or the other. We need to have that. So we need a nonpartisan citizens assembly to look at this really complicated question. And I don't know what's the best system, but I don't think I need to know that. I think we need people to take the time to take a look at what have you got around the world. And I've had people mention, Italy and Israel and all that. If you look at studies that look at all of the countries, statistically, they have higher voter satisfaction. They have higher voter involvement. They have greater diversity in the representation in their elected members. There's so many things that come along with it. You don't look at one country here and say, well, there, I'm going to get rid of it. I think we need to look at all of them. And then you got to find the system that works best for Ontario.
So in the last federal election, people agreed with you, and they had this longest ballot initiative to oppose it with, I think it was 200 and something candidates in Ottawa, Carleton. They're repeating it right now in this by-election in Alberta with, I can't remember what the number is, but it's like almost 200 candidates as well. Is that a way for people like you to clamor for change?
Oh, I don't think so. I think that longest ballot is bringing attention to the issue. And I don't think that attention is necessarily positive. To my mind, it makes me think of the climate activists who are throwing paint on valuable paintings to make their point. It gets attention, but it doesn't get good attention, So I'm not an advocate of that long party ballot. Yeah.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with our guest, just chatting about electoral reform. And is there an argument for proportional representation? And is this the time to get the Ontario Liberal Party, with a convention coming up in early September, to pass a platform that is in favor of it? We're going to take a break and come back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. Interesting conversation, I think a very relevant one. And the time to have this conversation, frankly, is now, with a couple of years to go before the next scheduled election, rather than just in the year before an election, because having that kind of reform happen right away, right before an election, is probably never going to happen. And so I think this is actually the right time to have this conversation. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're talking about electoral reform today with Roberta Tevlin. She actually hasn't been involved in politics herself a lot, but she's been peripherally aware of and involved. Her father ran for politics. Her brother ran successfully and served as a member in politics, and her niece ran for politics. And so she's had a lot of exposure to politics, but she's got very actively involved lately, and particularly in a local riding association, taking a policy resolution forward to the policy convention, to the convention that's coming up in a couple of weeks, arguing for the need for electoral reform. So let's talk about this. One of your arguments is that you need greater voter turnout, and that would benefit if we had electoral reform. And you also talk about more collaboration and more coalitions that have to get together. Yet, coalition has been sort of a dirty word. Stephen Harper ran against coalitions over and over and over again. And then finally, you also talk about how that would be a cause, a catalyst for greater diversity, more youth, more women, more LGBT voices, etc. At the same time, DEI and those kinds of voices on the right, at least in the United States, are thought of as a negative in today. So, it's almost as if you're arguing for a lot of things that, frankly, I agree with, but are out of favor today. So let's go through some of these things one by one. Voter turnout. Voter turnout has gone down dramatically over time, particularly with young people, where people under the age of 30 are voting. Less than 20% of them are voting. People my age and older, 80% of them are voting, and the average turnout is in the 30s, 40s, and 50s today, depending on whether it's a municipal, provincial, or federal election. The last municipal elections were, at least in Mississauga and in Toronto, in the 20% area. It came up in Toronto a little bit from the prior election with John Tory because there was a more competitive mayoralty race in the by-election. But with the prior John Tory election, it was in the 20s, which is dismal. Why do you think voter turnout has diminished so dramatically? Are we doing something wrong that young people just are not seeing any relevance in going out to vote?
Yeah. I actually end up hanging out and chatting a lot with younger people because I was a high school teacher until a few years ago. So I was talking with teenagers, and I play in a band, and we got a lot of younger people in the audience.
Hold it. You play in a band?
Yeah.
Tell me about the band. That sounds fun.
I play trombone in a New Orleans style jazz band. I've been playing on Saturday afternoons at Grossman's Tavern about 40 years now. So it's real traditional New Orleans style music. And there's a lot of young people getting into this older style of jazz rather than the modern weirdo jazz.
Awesome.
Yeah. So talking with young people.
Sorry, just a second.
Yes.
What's the tavern and where is it?
Oh, Grossman's Tavern. It's on Spadina in College, so center of Toronto. West central Toronto.
And every Saturday afternoon.
Every Saturday afternoon, yeah.
I'm gonna have to come check you out. Okay.
Back
to the story.
Yeah. So I as an older person, I do meet and chat with a lot of younger people, and yeah, they think they have no power in voting. They think it's rigged. They think the major parties are suspect. And even if they do think that there's a candidate or a party that they value, so often their vote doesn't get heard. A lot of them will be, say, Green Party members, and they rarely get a seat, so they feel powerless. They feel this is not the route for change. And they're also having a real rough time. They're the ones that are really hard hit with the economy and housing and all that stuff. So they figure they can't affect any change, and they're too busy doing all the other things to keep body and soul alive. I think that's a real problem. I'm really concerned about the lack of engagement of young people. And so when I looked at the various studies showing what happens in a country when they switch to a different form, when they get rid of the first past the post and they start having some other version, and it doesn't have to be strictly proportional representation, but some other version, the engagement of younger people increases. The number of young people who are actually elected um, increases. They become the MPs and the MPPs. I think that's a fantastic sign. And New Zealand is a really great example because they changed their electoral system in '96. So we've had, a couple of decades there to look at, well, how have things changed? And it's kind of like once you switch to a different form of representation, these other things occur naturally. And it's quite incredible the difference it makes.
Okay, so
Australia's another great example where they got two systems. The Senate is closer to proportional representation, and the other one is first past the post. And the proportion of women who are elected is dramatically different. It's less than half if you compare those two systems. It's the same country, it's the same time, but there's the two different systems, and it's stunning how different they are.
Okay, so let me confront you with a couple of questions,
Sure.
because I think a lot of people that are supportive of proportional representation, and let me say off the top, I am very supportive of proportional representation, but let me confront you because these are some of the issues that come up.
Yeah.
In addition to what you've said, the corollary also is that there's a lot of people that are on the right that end up getting elected. So in the last federal election, 2 federal elections ago, the Maxime Bernier party won 6% of the vote and got 0 seats. If we had proportional representation, they would have had 6% of the seats. They would have had probably official party status. Some people think that would have been terrible. Some people think that would have been great. And I'll give you, one example is that during the truckers' convoy, and I disagreed with some of the arguments that the trucker convoy was making, but during the trucker convoy, 15%, based on polls, of the Canadian population actually supported the trucker convoy and their desire against past vaccine mandates and vaccine, mask mandates and vaccine passports and things like that, and lockdowns, etc. Some people would say, it's a small minority and we should have disregarded their arguments. And some people say, well, if Maxime Bernier and his party were in parliament and that 15% were represented and elected MPs, and they were actually in parliament able to voice their arguments, that it would have dissipated some of the need for civil unrest and protests and things like that. So that, thinking about more women and more young people and more LGBT people, yes, that's possible. But also what you're probably going to have is right wing. Some people said if we have proportional representation, the Reform Canadian Alliance and the Conservative Party probably wouldn't have joined. There probably would be still 2 parties, and they'd be able to actually maybe, have more votes. Because there would be a right wing that would really appeal to right wing voters, and a centrist or less right wing, more centrist party that would be able to broaden the appeal. And then afterwards, they might actually have more votes and get together. And so, and then arguably, the Liberals, who have never been above 50% for probably a generation or 2, would never be able to form government unless they had the NDP or the Bloc Québécois or the Green Party or all of the above supporting them. So in addition to everything you said in regards to young people, women, LGBT people getting a voice, more than likely the right wing is going to get a voice. The extreme right wing is going to get a voice, and neither the Conservative Party or the Liberal Party would be able to form government unless they got either the left or the right to support them in a coalition. Is that good?
I think it sounds scary, but I don't think it's as bad as you might imagine. I think if your extreme right gets some seats in the government, and that appears to be a route that they can use, I think they become less extreme because they have a voice. They got some kind of agency. And if they actually want to go somewhere with that, they're going to have to tone their language down. They're going to have to compromise some of their, and this is another aspect that the studies of these various countries show is the level of civility in the political discourse changes when you get past first past the post. First past the post drives polarization, drives insulting language, drives disparaging remarks about the opposition. But if you need to work with these other people, you have to listen to them. You have to find common ground if you want to get anywhere. And so instead of having elections where you have this election whiplash where, oh, liberal majority, whoop, conservative majority, whatever, it's more like a nuanced site shifting. And um, the liberals, yeah, the liberals need to make friends with the other parties. And I think that what the Liberal NDP work that they did in the last federal government, bringing in the pharmacare. I mean, I was astounded when my son, who has diabetes, got off my health plan, and I discovered he has to pay for his insulin. It's not a life choice thing, you know. The birth control, the child care. I think that was a good combination. They had common ground, and they brought some NDPs working with the Liberals, brought in some really good programs.
So some people would say that the Liberal Party under Justin Trudeau, the Liberal Party that existed up until December, January of this past year, was more left wing than it should have been, and that it ever has been in the past, and that it was the agreement, the supply and confidence agreement with the NDP that pulled them to the left, and that's why they lost so much support. And that therefore, if they had a majority, they would have been able to have been more centrist, which is where some people would suggest Mark Carney has taken the party. So again, if the Conservatives have got to appeal to right-wing parties to get a majority in a proportional representation situation, or the Liberals have got to appeal to and be in coalition with left-wing parties to get close to a majority, is that actually good? And you'd say that, you say that these parties, once elected in a proportional representation, will end up being more reasonable. The experience in Israel, in Italy, is not that they actually have the ability to be more unreasonable, that it's when they're forced to be part of a big tent that they've got to moderate some of their views, even if they're frustrated by that, because that's the only way that the whole party can continue to exist. And, every once in a while they'll split off into a Reform Party or Canadian Alliance Party or the, what was the NDP split up? I can't even remember. It's the Waffle,
There's
right?
so many, yeah.
The NDP, had the Waffle Party that split off of it and then came back in. So, you've had that situation. But
and again, you mentioned Israel and Italy, and in statistics, we kind of call that cherry picking. When you look at the other 100+ countries, you see, in fact, a different story. And I don't know why Italy is the way it is, but certainly Israel is a very unusual situation. And I wouldn't use that as evidence of what, and also the particular kind of proportional representation they have is not one that has ever been suggested for Canada, and I believe it would not be allowed in our constitution. The details I'm not happy with, but again, you need to look at and I would say, the Liberals working with the NDP and the Greens, that could be a good thing.
What about, Stephen Harper made coalition's a bad word, effectively, mainly because he said that, the Liberals back in, when was it, 2011, would have had to have, in 2009, actually, when there was an agreement negotiated between the Liberals, the NDP, and the Bloc Québécois, that to gain power, they would have had to include in government separatists. So would you support a coalition government if the Bloc Québécois was part of it?
If they're looking at healthcare, if they're looking at trade, if they're looking, there's so many things beyond the separatist part. I would say, and the deal could be, we're not looking at separation. We are looking at all these other things that we do have in common. So I could see that.
So I actually agree with you, and I think that it's interesting.
Oh dear, I'm sorry.
No, I think this is a great conversation. I think that Stephen Harper, for whatever reason, made coalition and cooperation bad words. And I think cooperation and compromise and coalition are great words. I think that's what you've got to do in real life. That's what you got to do in business. I think that my way or the highway is not the way to have best decisions making. And the reality is people think differently, and so therefore everyone does deserve a voice. There are some other alternatives though, and mixed member proportional is one of them. So I'm going to take a break, and when we can come back, I'm going to ask you, Roberta, about some of the other options that have been thought of and proposed, rather than just straight proportional representation, because I do think that straight proportional representation, which is what Israel has got, may not be the right solution, and mixed member proportional representation might be a potential solution. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in just 2 minutes with our citizen expert, our citizen advocate, Roberta Tevlin. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Roberta Tevlin with us tonight. She is an activist within the Liberal Party, taking forward a resolution to the upcoming annual meeting, policy convention, whatever it is, I can't even know, and arguing in favor of a reform of our political system away from the first past the post system. Roberta, one of the things that some people have said is that when you go with straight proportional representation, you end up having these lists that are prepared by the parties of who are the top people, and they get sort of divvied up over time based on the proportion of the votes, and that separates the local representative from the local riding, and that's a negative. And so therefore, some people have suggested something that they call mixed member proportional, which would be a combination of first past the post in a local area and proportional representation. And so, what it would be, and there's a couple different ways that do it, but the easiest way of thinking about it is that you have effectively two ridings that would be joined. And what you would do in that riding is you would elect for the representative of the riding the person that won the first past the post in a ballot that got the most votes. But then after you did that sort of analysis, you would then balance out the election of a whole bunch of other people, half of the legislature effectively, to make sure that the proportions of the seats were equal to the proportion of the votes. And so therefore, effectively, half of the legislature would be elected to represent, based on the first past the post, a local riding, and half would be elected by either that riding or by that area, because they'd be still representing an area, if not the specific riding, based on balancing to get to a end result where the number of seats equal the number of votes. Now, Dalton McGuinty said the only way you could do that is by doubling the size of the legislature. You don't. You can keep it the same size and just have half elected one way and half elected the other way. But it's sort of a way of keeping the tie to local representatives. And in the last election, actually, if you had half elected by first past the post, because there are, numerous rural ridings that have more than 50% of the vote going to the Conservatives, a significant amount, not 50%, but a significant amount of the ridings would be elected by people that would have more than 50% of the vote. And so therefore they really deserve to win that riding. Not actually 50, but close to 50. Is that a good system, do you think?
I think that's one of many compromise systems, because I think you're right. People do want a particular person in their riding, somebody who they feel they can talk to, who seems personable, who, that emotional tie, I think, is important in Canadian politics. So some aspect of that is needed. The resolution that we've put together is not suggesting which is the best system. I think pure proportional representation has real problems, but there's a variety of compromises that allow for local and getting closer to proportional representation. But we're not saying which it is. I think one reason why some of the other electoral reform movements have not worked is they get caught up in which one are you going for. I think it's premature and it's divisive to select the system here. It's good to know that there are systems that balance local representation and party representation, and there's quite a few. But I'm actually feel quite comfortable knowing I don't have to make that decision. I don't have to have the answers. I do know that the first past the post has got to go, and just about anything would be better. And I'm willing to put my faith in a nonpartisan citizens assembly that's going to look at this thoroughly and seriously and make the right decision.
Well, I certainly agree with you in regards to the nonpartisan. I think we're seeing that today with the gerrymandering in Texas and the United States, where the elected representatives have the right to change the boundaries of ridings and manipulate a system where the first past the post can dramatically change the results of an election depending on how you draw the boundaries of the ridings. Yeah. One of the big benefits that we have in Canada, I think, is we have the elections commission that set boundaries, and they try to keep it sort of square and natural to natural boundaries and community boundaries, and sort of equal in size across the country, because you do have the situation where you can have some ridings that get down to like 60,000 people and other ridings that get up to like 130,000 people. And so ridings that each elect one person can be dramatically different in size, though they're supposed to be all around 100,000. However, I think that electoral reform, if we're going to do it, should be more open to lots of different judgments and decisions. So let me ask you about a couple of others while I got you, because this is kind of interesting. Sure. One of the big issues right now in the UK is lowering the voting age. Scotland and Wales have got the voting age at 16, and Britain, England, is thinking about changing it for the whole UK to 16. Yeah. And the argument is kind of interesting that 16 is when you can get a license. And today with education, with social media, with a whole bunch of other things, the sense is that people are more informed and making adult-like decisions at a younger age. And then one of the other interesting argument is that if you actually lowered it to 16, half of the population would actually vote for the first time when they're still in high school. And so therefore, once they vote once, the chances are that they'll continue to vote. And when the first time you vote, you're voting when you're at college or university or getting your first job in your 18 to 24 range, 18 to 22 range. You may be in a different community than where you had lived because you went off to university or college. So therefore, you may not be as involved. You may not be as knowledgeable with the local issues. You may not be as connected. You may not vote. And once you don't vote once, the propensity is to not vote again. So what do you think? Should we lower the vote to 16?
I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, if this movement goes forward, that's the next one I want to look at. Because again, as a high school teacher, I worked with those students, and 16 is just a couple of years younger than the present system, but they're at home. They're at home, and the teachers and within the schools, you can generate an excitement. Let's go out and vote. And as you pointed out, once you vote, you tend to continue to vote. They've done studies on this. And when you don't vote, I mean, if you're in your first or second year university or college, you're either working so hard to pass those courses or you're out partying. You don't have a lot of extra brain space necessarily for thinking about voting. And I think it's a great idea.
So you're a high school student, you'll know these people well. Let me ask a couple of questions. So the counter to that is, number one, that 16, 17-year-olds, can't make decisions on their own. They're not smart enough. They're not wise enough. They're not as involved enough. Another group, primarily on the left, argue, well, they'll just vote the way their parents vote. So if their parents are conservative, they'll vote conservative. Another argument on the right is, they're all going to be left-wing. They're going to be climate activists, and they're all going to, elect socialists. And so you got some people saying, they'll all vote left. You got another people will say, well, they'll only just vote the way their parents vote. And another group saying, they're not adult yet, and so they don't deserve the vote. What do you think? Will high school students vote all left, all the way their parents, or not at all because they're not educated enough?
The not educated enough, there's not a huge difference between a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old. There is a difference, but it's not a huge difference. It's not a on-off switch. So I don't think that's what. If they vote like their parents, is that a problem? Maybe that first time they'll vote like their parents. But after that, they've got the habit of voting, and they'll maybe start voting differently. I did not always vote like my father. he accepted that sometimes I nudge towards the NDP, so I think it's a great idea. I think it's a small change that can have a huge ripple effect. But that's my next fight.
Okay, well, then let me talk about another one. So,
Okay.
Australia, you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Australia thinks that one of the big benefits they have is compulsory voting. And it's not that you go to jail if you don't vote, but you do pay a penalty tax if you don't vote. And they don't get 100% turnout, but they get turnout that is close to 100%. And one of the arguments for that is, and you've been involved in knocking on doors, one of the arguments is that in Canadian politics, American politics, we've got this huge desire to just go to the door, identify your vote, and then get it out. You don't actually spend much time talking to people and trying to persuade them, because if they've always voted conservative, you just go past the door and then you don't frankly talk to them anymore because you don't want to encourage them to go into the ballot box. Or if you're a conservative and they vote Liberal or NDP, you don't, again, you just sort of skip the door and you go past. And you can see this even on election day, where all the Liberals will put door hangers on all the Liberal doors, not even do anything with the Conservative doors to encourage their vote to go out. So that elections become identify and get out. In a compulsory voting system, everyone's going to go vote. And so the identify and get out the vote goes away. So what do you got to do? You actually have to talk to people and persuade people. And so therefore you have more civil discourse. You've got to make friends. You've got to persuade. You've got to actually go out and try to convince people to vote your way. And to take it one step farther, in Canadian elections and American elections, actually what you try to do sometimes is discourage people from voting. So you point out a lot of the negatives about your opposition, and you try to, reduce the turnout. Well, if they're turning out, there's no benefit to doing that. In fact, you don't want to piss people off. And so therefore, again, you come back to that. It's a more positive discourse. It's a more civil discourse. It's a more persuasion oriented rather than just identify and get out the vote. So what do you think? Should we have compulsory voting? Get the turnout from 40% to close to 100%?
I had that question on the back burner. You're very persuasive there, and I hadn't quite seen it in that light. And it reminds me, actually, in high school. Sorry, back to the high school thing. They brought in the 40 hours of compulsory voluntary work in high school. To graduate, you have to do 40 hours in those 4 years of volunteer work. And I thought when they brought this in, this is a terrible idea. It's going to destroy all true volunteerism. And what I saw is, in fact, that students realized they did this and they realized, I like doing this. It opened their eyes to it. I had so many students logging thousands of hours. And in a way, it kind of gave them an excuse. Well, oh, no, I can't go and do whatever I have to do my compulsory hours. Oh, yeah, you poor, it worked way better than I expected. And I could see how compulsory voting, where you have to vote, might in fact get more people thinking about voting and taking an interest, as well as all the advantages you've mentioned.
The counter to that is freedom. Why force me to vote? The counter to that is we force you to get a driver's license. We force you to get an OHIP card. We force you to get a birth certificate. We force you to get a passport. We force you to wear a seatbelt. So there's a lot of things in our society that are arguably compulsory. And if you don't do it, you don't go to jail, but you may pay a fine. What do you think about that?
Maybe I'll make that my third campaign. That sounds very convincing.
Okay, so we've talked about proportional representation. We've talked about mixed member proportional. We've talked about lowering the voting age. We've talked about compulsory voting. One of the other things that people have talked about is preferential voting. And the argument here is that no party would ever elect a leader on first past the post. What they would do is they would demand that they get 50.1% of the vote. And so they have successive ballots until such time as they get 50.1% of the vote. Some people say, well, what that means is that people have got to make friends and cooperate because they want people to come to them successive ballots. Other people have said, no, what you're going to do is you're always going to get the compromise candidate. You're never going to get, what you really want. And so therefore, you'll never get a Green, you'll never get an NDP a voter, because in the end, other people will have to go to the Conservatives or other people have to go to the Liberals to get over that 50.1%. And so therefore, you're going to end up having arguably in the end a two-party system. So there's people municipally, and I understand that your niece ran municipally.
Yeah.
There's people municipally that are arguing for this preferential vote, because right now our system municipally is that incumbency is so powerful that it's almost impossible for someone to beat the incumbent. And the only way that they think you can do that is by this preferential voting system and make people get up to and above 50%, which would be, the way we elect our leaders. What do you think of that? Do you think that makes sense?
I think that makes sense. And I also think it makes sense where you're framing it. So what works really well in a municipal election, which are largely non-party elections, may be different from what works best in a party system. So, I don't know where that one fits with a provincial election, but I think it's one of the systems that should be looked at: preferential voting, various kinds of ranked ballot voting. It's a very complicated question, and it's not one that should be decided by a party leader or a party or indeed a referendum. It needs a group of people taking a serious look at the evidence, at what is done around the world, and how to make sure we get the best system.
Okay, so one of the issues about this upcoming convention that I will ask you, because I don't want to ask you about how you would vote, and just so if people don't know, it's because I used to be related to one of the people that is considered in this situation, is when you elect a leader, they have to get 50.1%. But there's this big debate that's sort of never been codified in any sort of constitution, is that when you have a leadership review, 50.1% is not enough. You got to get 2/3. What's your sense? In a leadership review, is 50.1% okay, or do you got to get 66%?
I think I really don't have a strong opinion on that. My opinion actually is, I think there's actually way too much attention paid to who's the leader and not about how is the party functioning and what are its policies. To give an example, I went to the Liberal website and I found out how to present a policy resolution, what you have to do. And I brought it to my local PLA, and they were all excited. We're going to do this. And then I discovered that page sitting there, right there, and it's still sitting there, I checked yesterday, on the Ontario Liberal Party's website, is a dead page. The links don't work. The Google form goes nowhere. But it says in such friendly words, we value your input. To me, that's an example of how there's some deep problems in the structure. In fact, and then I was talking actually to the former VP of Policy, Fahim Khan. He explained to me that at the AGM, there will be no route for policy resolutions to be brought forward. And in fact, there hasn't been an AGM doing that since 2010. That's outrageous. How are the grassroots, how are the local ridings supposed to bring their concerns forward when for 15 years, there hasn't been an opportunity? I understand that we're supposed to get one next year, but I think it's horrendous that we haven't had one, and that there's been this pretend page sitting up there for so long. I'm more concerned about the party structure and the communications. It's way too much top down, and less concerned with who specifically is a leader, unless a leader wants to say that we are really concerned about grassroots and this is what we're gonna do,
Fascinating conversation. We're going to take a final break, and when we come back, if it's okay, I'm going to give my point of view on these topics, and we'll see what Roberta's got to say to them. Stay with us, everyone. Back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've had Roberta Tevlin on. She's a political activist within the Liberal Party, and she is taking forward a resolution to the upcoming provincial convention to say there has to be electoral reform. And so I thought I would end by, what if I had the opportunity to change things, how I would change things, and I would have, I think, a several point agenda. Number one, I would lower the voting age. I think that if people, half the population between 16 and 18 voted for the first time while they were in high school, every single politician would go to that high school for an assembly and make a pitch. These people would be, in fact, the most knowledgeable and the most involved, and I think they would actually make great decisions. And I think they are wise enough, educated enough, social media newsworthy, involved enough that they would actually be very influential and positive in our decision-making process. And I think once you vote once, just like once you go to the blood donor clinic once, you'll tend to do that for the rest of your life. So I think that that's a very positive change. Second of all, I would have compulsory voting. I think that this identify, get out the vote is a huge waste of time. I think the negative advertising is a huge waste of money. I think if Coke spent all their time talking negatively about Pepsi, you would have a very, bad marketplace. I think what you should be doing is persuading, talking positive about your candidate, talking positively about your polls and your policies. And so therefore, if everyone was going to the ballot box, or almost everyone that was going to the ballot box, I think that our politics would become far more civil, far more cooperative, far more positive, and it would be a better system. I think we need some proportional representation. I'm not sure if proportional representation in the House of Commons or the legislature actually makes sense, and I actually don't like the mixed member proportional. So my suggestion would be, and this works federally, it doesn't work provincially, but I would have the Senate be elected, effective, and equal the way that Preston Manning argued about it, but I would elect it by way of proportional representation, and that would be on a regional basis, and I think that makes sense. So that if we balanced out how much the West, Ontario, Freudian slip there, Ontario, Quebec, and the East have, and then elected people to the Senate within those regions on proportional representation over time as people age out. So it's not all elected at the same time, but it's elected over time, comparable to the way the Senate of the United States has, where there's a third elected every 2 years. So it's sort of a continuous change rather than a wholesale one-time change. And you did that on proportional representation, and you made that the Senate was actually effective, had to really approve what the House of Commons, what the Parliament approves. I think we'd end up having a very effective system. And then I'd add two more to my methodology. And the last one is sort of like what you were saying about the ability for you to bring resolutions forward to the Ontario Party. I think we should be able to bring referendum forward to the nation. And I do think referendum are a great way to make sure that citizens are heard, even if the elected representatives don't want to do it. And then also, I think we should have recall. And the recall is a huge benefit. And the recall, where you actually get to have force a vote on an interim between the elections, even if it doesn't pass, the threat of a recall disciplines the representatives such that they get their act together real quick to make sure that they're doing a good job. So I think it's representation, and increase the representation and make it somewhat proportional. Referendum and recall would be my agenda. Roberta, what do you think?
I hadn't even thought about recall. I'm a little bit nervous about referenda because how you phrase them and how they're promoted can be iffy. But I'm with you on voting age, and you mentioned Senate. Now, Senate, that's a federal thing, right?
Yeah.
I'm looking at provincial electoral reform. We don't have a Senate. Yeah. So I really think that electoral reform, whatever form it takes, and we'll have a nice compromise system, is what we need. And I just would like to mention to your listeners that if anyone's interested in being involved in this, I would love to hear from you. The thing you can do is, if you contact your local Liberal PLA president, you can find their name and address online, and say you are in favor of this, and that'll help a lot, because we really need. It can't come from one riding; it's got to come from many ridings. And so, I'm Roberta Tevlin, and my email is really easy: roberta.tevlin@gmail.com.
Roberta Tevlin, thank you so much for joining us. And I think this is a really important conversation. I hope you have it within the Liberal Party, but I hope the whole province, if not the whole country, has it, because I think that electoral reform is something that is sorely needed. I think if our voting turnout trends continue the way that they are, we're going to have a small minority of people making the decisions that govern our country and our province and our cities. And that's not right. Thank you. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Good night.